All right, everyone. Well, now that we know who we are, like I say, we'll have a little bit of business for the membership to vote on later and consider. But first, the reason why many of you are here is we've been dealing for some months with a very across the country, including here in Oregon, including here in Washington County, with a lot of challenges around conservative mistruths and misdirection about critical race theory in education, especially, and that featured very strongly in the school board elections in some communities here in our county. And so our vice chair, Marquita Meyer, had the idea of reaching out to someone who could talk to us a little bit about that and give us some ideas about what the realities are. And so Dr. Marvin Lynn, as you heard a moment ago, is a member of the Tigard-Tualatin School Board. We were really excited to support his candidacy this past cycle. And so he's also in his other professional career, an educational administrator, worked in higher education as a professor, and has really been an expert on this idea of how to have equitable education. So he's very widely published, and we'd like to just get right into hearing from him. So please take it away, Dr. Lynn.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's really my pleasure to be here. I am going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see. All right. Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So really glad to have this opportunity to talk with you tonight. And I'll try to be concise because I know there's a lot to do, but I have three main goals. And one of them is to provide a concise definition of CRT, which is hard to do because it's a very complex thing, right? But then to talk about how it's been misused by the right, share some examples, some illustrations of that, and then talk about how our party might be engaged in this discussion while examining our own processes using critical race theory as a lens, in fact, which is what we do in higher education. So I'll give you a sort of example of how that could be done here. So what is critical race theory? Well, it is a critique of American jurisprudence. It's a critique of this idea that the law is objective. One of the key questions that critical race theorists ask is, if the law is in fact objective, why does it appear to serve mainly the interest of white people in the US? And there's a range of legal studies and conversations around that very question. I refer to critical race theory as, in fact, a theory. And a theory is used by scholars, in this case, legal scholars, to systematically examine the persistence of racism in American society. A theory is an explanation of why something happens or occurs in a particular way. And so legal scholars draw on that framework as a way to situate their research. It's also a method. It's a method that they use to tell stories about the way the law, in fact, does not serve communities of color. And if you read the research of critical race theorists, you'll hear and see lots of stories and counter stories told about that. So it's also considered to be a method, and it's used in the field of education too. But it also helps us to think about how we might imagine a different reality. So some of us have written counter stories that are totally fictionalized, but that paint a different reality. If you read the work of Derek Bell, for example, some of his chronicles and stories paint a very different reality in terms of what could be. So it can be hopeful as well. So the core principles of CRT. One of them is about the nature of race, right? We believe that race is a social construction, which means it doesn't have a biological basis. We also believe that race operates in the form of a psychological wage for white people. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about this, but critical race theorists also believes that in this idea, others have talked about this wage that people have. They also talk about it as a form of property that is owned by whites, a form of highly valued property and so race, while it is a social construction, it does have very real economic, social, and political consequences that we can observe and measure. And the observation and the measurement of outcomes that are race-based is really the key aspect of what critical race theorists do is measure sort of these outcomes, and they talk about them and they use them as evidence for why racism continues to persist. We also see racism and white supremacy as endemic, meaning that it is part of the cultural makeup of our society. It is part of the founding of the society. It is also structural, meaning that it is not based on individual actions or behaviors, that it is part of a system of advantages and privileges and disadvantages based on race. Derek Bell talks about racism as permanent because of the way in which our society was structured based on these racist ideals. But it is also intersectional in nature because racism interacts with sexism and homophobia and transphobia and other isms to create a unique set of experiences for BIPOC people who are different in those ways, right? And so it interacts with these other forms of discrimination all the time. And so the term intersectionality is a term you probably have heard used, and that's what we mean by that. So racism and white supremacy don't operate alone. They always operate sort of in tandem with these other forms of discrimination. The other important principle that I want to sort of highlight tonight, because I will come back to this, is this idea of BIPOC people really as being central to the narrative. So critical race theory is by, for, and about BIPOC folks, even though you will see some white critical race theorists doing some really excellent work. The focus of the storytelling, of the narrative, of the theorizing is on BIPOC folks. And so their stories, their experiences are lifted up and central to the story. So what are we seeing in terms of this attack on CRT? Well, the right has constructed a broad disinformation campaign that's designed to confuse the electorate, but I think more importantly, and I say its electorate, which is conservatives, right? More importantly, to halt really a progressive agenda that was really about increasing understanding about the nature of inequality in America. So it's mostly in reaction, I think, to this racial reckoning that we saw in America post the murder and the heinous killing of George Floyd. So what I want to play for you is just a couple of snippets of videos that I think capture sort of the sophistication with which the right is really approaching this issue. Are you seeing the video?
Yes, we can see it. Yes. Thank you.
Did somebody say they couldn't see the video?
Yes, that was me. I could not see any video.
Anybody else see it?
It was good.
Okay, okay, well, okay.
I can totally see it.
Okay,
I saw the whole thing.
okay, right, and that was a minute long, right? And it's slick, it's got great music, it's not talking at you, it keeps your attention, right? But it shows you images of conflict and people angry and the words, right, that are identified and used, bold, big letters, right? So it's a quick, slick thing. I think it's viewed over 1 million times on YouTube. And so that's one example. Here's another example of the kind of thing that's being used and that's been viewed many, many times on the internet, just to give you a sense of what they're doing. Okay, I was supposed to, let me see, let me not do that. Let's go here. I think this is the one. There it is. All right. Can you see that?
Have you heard about critical race theory? I'm guessing you probably have. It has already insinuated itself into many institutions and is making rapid progress into others. If it takes hold, it will completely change the very nature of America and the way you live. Critical race theory holds that the most important thing about you is your race. The color of your skin, that's who you are. Not your behavior, not your values, not your environment, your race. In critical race theory, if you are a member of a minoritized racial group, their term, not mine, you are a victim of a system that is rigged against you, a system that doesn't want you to succeed. On the other hand, if your race is privileged, you're an exploiter, whether you intend to be or not. Critical race theory begins from the assumption that racism occurs in all interactions. To see how this works, consider this thought experiment. Imagine you own a shop and 2 customers enter at the same time, one white and one black. Who do you help?
So the key here is to really personalize it, right? Is to turning it into something that people feel like it's a personal attack on them as individuals. And the PragerU comes across as, an institution of higher learning. And so people on the right trust it because of that and its credentials and so on. So very, very interesting kind of set of situations, I think, that we are dealing with right now. It's important to note that campaigns like this one, really have an architectural structure. Mr. Christopher Ruffo here is the architect of this movement against CRT. If you don't know that, you need to know that. There was a June issue of the New Yorker that outlines his sort of intentional strategy to confuse the public and to use CRT as a moniker for anything that is considered progressive. So, and he says it in sort of plain language. Here are a couple of quotes from Christopher Ruffo. Actually, he tweeted these out. Here's the first quote. Hey, we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into a public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. All the various cultural insanities under that brand category. Remember that phrase. The next thing he says, he tweets it again. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and we will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. Again, annexing and connecting critical race theory to an entire range of ideas which have absolutely nothing to do with critical race theory, but to bring those things into people's minds as they hear the term CRT or critical race theory, right? So here's an example of the way in which that has happened. The Center for Renewing America has a whole set of CRT terms that they have highlighted. There's a map here. Can you see this map? But this map shows you the 28 states that have restricted education on race and racial bias and so on in the US based on the work of Christopher Ruffo, who actually wrote a template for state legislators to follow, right, as they were considering banning critical race theory. So at the same time, the right is arming its base. The Center for Renewing America has provided this electorate with a set of tools that they can use to combat the teaching of CRT in their schools. The resources include a list of books, including my own, my book is on there, that are considered dangerous. It reminds me of Nazi Germany before they fully began to implement the final solution. This list also includes a list of terms that are considered to be CRT, right? Because Christopher said we want to attach a whole set of ideas to CRT to really scare people to death. And so many of these terms have been used in the educational landscape for a long time and have no relationship. So here they are. Here's just a few of them. And I tried to kind of pick ones that might be ones that you might be familiar with, but there's many, many more terms on this list if you go to their webpage, right? All of these, land acknowledgement, CRT, right? Multiculturalism. So we can't talk about patriarchy, restorative justice, social emotional learning, social justice, woke, right? All of these terms are now considered CRT. And so as a school board member, and Ben can attest to this, we have people coming in and saying, stop doing social emotional learning because it is CRT, right? And this is why. This campaign has led to anti-CRT legislation that has been passed, as I said before, in a couple of dozen states. And really, our educators are suffering. I heard a heartbreaking story this afternoon from Amy D'Onofrio. She's a teacher, or was a teacher, in Jacksonville, Florida, who was fired because her mostly Black students asked her to put up a Black Lives Matter flag in her classroom. And when she was asked to take it down, she said, show me the rule book that says I can't have it up. They couldn't produce the rule book. They found a way to get rid of her. She did win a big settlement, thankfully, as a result of being unjustly fired. An African-American principal, James Whitfield in Texas, was fired because he said in writing that America has a problem with race. Now, he said this in a newsletter to parents over a year ago. But somebody found it and brought it to the school board and said, yeah, you got to get rid of this guy. And so he is on leave and he is suing, and all this other stuff is going on. Another teacher in Tennessee, Matt Hahn, was fired because he too admitted that racism was part of the American fabric. He's a social studies teacher, so he's talking about it within the context of a lesson in his classroom. I should also mention that in Florida, where Amy is, professors are also under attack for teaching social emotional learning, diversity and inclusion in the classroom, and so on. So this is bigger than K-12, but I think that these K-12 educators and leaders are examples. I think, first responders, I would even think of these people as right now who have suffered and whose jobs and lives are on the line because of this. So what are the political implications? Well, I believe that the political implications of these actions are vast at national and state levels. Nationally, what Kimberly Crenshaw and others who have been in this movement a long time and who understand the history of these kinds of movements really think about this as the rise of fascism in McCarthy era politics. And the way that the right has worked is that they have ensured that this happens at the local level, which is why school boards are under such attack, right? So if we can get the curriculum shifted, if we can get the local politics done in a particular way, if we can pass legislation in the state, then we can sort of erect this overall fascist regime, which restricts what you can know, what you can teach, what you can think, and what you can learn. It's also about suppressing what's considered progressive discourse and practice within all institutions, not just schools. And the narrowing of curriculum and teaching to leading to what Alan Bloom, I think in the 90s, called the closing of the American mind. And he talked about the closing of the American mind because multiculturalism was going to have that impact. And I'm arguing the opposite, of course, that the not teaching of multiculturalism, in fact, impacts us in that way. And people will vote because of fear. And that is the goal, ultimately. In Oregon, we don't have legislation, thankfully. We have a very supportive legislature and governor and other electeds who I think are supportive. But I don't have to talk about what has happened in Albany and what is the catastrophe that is Newburgh. And there are other places where there are pretty horrible things happening. I think what's happening more broadly, though, is that teachers are afraid to teach challenging subjects. Teachers are worried about, can I teach slavery? Can I teach about the Trail of Tears? Am I going to be fired? Even though there's no legislation that suggests that they will, there's still fear that teachers have about trying to do what they know is the right thing to do in terms of teaching the truth of American history. again, I'm a school board member, so there's a steady parade of conservative activists dominating our meetings and I think Tigard-Tualatin is pretty lucky. I think we have gotten so far, and I'm not inviting this, but so far I don't think we've gotten as many of these folks as some of us have. But people are emboldened and are coming to meetings and disseminating these sort of messages of fear in the public sphere, and are feeling much more emboldened about doing that and doubling down, right, on these really racist and exclusionary beliefs. And what I'm seeing, you know, in higher education is that progressives, people who are typically sort of outspoken about their progressive beliefs, are silenced, are not saying anything for fear that they may be attacked, right? So there isn't a conversation happening in more progressive spaces that I'm seeing. And there are questions about the progressive agenda and where we're going. I did get an outreach from a person who is a Democrat living in Washington County who said, I'm worried about the teaching of critical race theory in the school system. And so while that person is, you know, typically and has typically voted Democrat, is now listening to what Christopher Ruffo and others are saying and is being swayed by that. And I really worry about that happening on a much larger scale. And I think it's something that this party should be very concerned about too. So what do we do about it? Well, here's what I suggest. I think we got to get out there and remind the electorate about why democracy is important, right? I think that, you know, Obama was always so good at reminding us of the vision, of what democracy was supposed to mean, how it was supposed to look, and how it's supposed to feel. I remember when he was campaigning on behalf of Biden, how he said, you know, really directly to Trump, we don't seek to be ruled or something like that. But he was talking about the idea of living in a kind of autocratic state, which is what I think some people want. And talking about and helping us understand why that is not where we want to be. And so I think we have a responsibility to continue that. I think we have to engage in strategic marketing to really call out the use of these fear tactics. These are fear tactics, and we have to call them what they are, and let the voters know that you are scared because they want you to be scared. I think we have to also be very clear about why social emotional learning, multicultural education, and other types of discussions that we've been having in schools for a long time are important, and why they contribute to the creation of and the development of a democratic society that is free thinking, right? And so we can use social media, we can use all types of media to do that. Kimberly Crenshaw had a conversation with a well-known reporter the other day on her podcast, and they were talking about this notion of two-sidism, that the media is really reporting the Christopher Ruffos of the world who've admitted that they are misleading us on purpose, that they are equating those people with people like Kimberly Crenshaw and people like me, and sort of in the name of this thing they call two-sidism. And it's not really real. And I think that what they suggest is that we collaborate particularly with the local media to help them understand that to promote a false narrative isn't promoting or advancing, you know, a different opinion. You're advancing and promoting lies. And that is not truth in reporting. So how do we, you know, if we're going to do that work with the media and in other ways, we have to also think about the party and what it is we're doing internally and how we address some of our own internal challenges. And I think CRT might be a tool to help us begin to think about how to do that. So, you know, we could think about our decision-making processes and think about whether or not they are truly democratic and inclusive, right? And what I mean by that is, here's an example. Is a strict adherence to Robert Rules of Order, right, that was created around 1874 or something like that, is that the best way to incorporate all voices, or is it best for those who are most comfortable with what I think we would all agree is a very complicated process, right? So that's just one example of something we can look at. I'm not saying throw it out, but it's an example of something we could look at if we're going to think about how to apply some of these principles around social justice to us as we begin to do this work together. You know, some people have questioned, I've read a couple of articles online where people have questioned whether or not Roberts really intended to include Black people, given when this was created, right? That we were, you know, the Reconstruction period, and there were real challenges. The other thing is, you know, as a professional working in higher education and working in other organizations, that I've noticed that there tends to be a big focus on process, and decision-making is highly process oriented. And I think the trend that I see is that sometimes invisibilizes minoritized members of these organizations in ways that I think are probably not intended, right? And so can we look at that? How is the process of decision-making invisibilizing and exclusionary in ways that we don't intend? And then, you know, I think the bigger question then is, how can we create a more inclusive county and state party that recognizes racism as a given, right? So if we're going to sort of draw on a CRT framework, we recognize that racism is always present. And so to be accused of furthering white supremacy or racism is not an insult, it's a truism, because it's always there, it's always in the room. And there are ways in which we all further it and promote it in ways that we don't even understand. And so how do we recognize that, deal with that, and then center the voices of BIPOC folks who may be not participating fully because of the kinds of structures and strategies that we put into place that make it difficult for that to happen. And so what I wanted to do was to sort of give you an overview of CRT, but then try to think about how it applies to our condition in terms of what's happening in schools and education, but also how we can think about the work that we need to be doing as a political party to move us forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. We're all clapping in our, we're muted though. Do you have a few minutes if there's any questions? Would that be all right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, if you have a question, we'll just have a few minutes here. Feel free to raise your hand on Zoom, and we'll start out with Lisa.
Let's see. Okay, I have a quick question. I'm trying to unmute everything. So my quick question is simply, how intersectional do you see this with the whole anti-vax, anti-mask crowd that is cramming our school boards, and they're also the ones yelling about CRT? How do you see that intersectionality and how it relates to the fear-mongering that you talked about? That's all part of this.
Yeah, well, amazingly, the people who say that we shouldn't be talking about race don't believe in science either, right? And they tend to have, you know, and I would argue in many cases don't believe in democracy. So, I mean, at least that's the way it looks to me right now. And so, yeah, these folks kind of are the same. As my wife always says, you know, show me your friends, you'll show me your character.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it looks like we have a question from Wynn.
Yes, I was wondering, you were talking about how to use it during a meeting. Would one example of that be to ask people of different nationalities or a BIPOC community how they see whatever we're talking about? Because maybe from their perspective, they see it differently.
Well, what I like about what you're saying, Wynn, is this idea of being intentional about the inclusion of racialized minority groups, right? And I think we have to consult with those groups. You know, I see Rosa here, for example, around what's the best way to do that, right? How do we find the best way to be inclusive of African Americans, for example, who are part of this, or Latinx folks. And it doesn't just, you know, not just racialized minorities. I think we can talk about sexual minorities as well, right? But certainly, you know, CRT is kind of focused on race. But yeah, I think being intentional about how to be inclusive. And I've been reading the work of Lonnie Guinier. You guys might remember, you know, she was at some point gonna be considered for the Supreme Court, and then all this controversy arose around her scholarly writing, which is focused on cumulative voting, which is all about, you know, how do we ensure that minoritized communities get a real say and get to participate in the electoral process, even if their numbers are not huge, right? So that we don't have what she refers to as the tyranny of the majority. And I think what sometimes happens in large organizations that are mostly white is that because the majority always rules, what it ultimately ends up meaning is that white people always get their way and that minoritized voices, because they're smaller in number, don't necessarily have a say. And so she has talked about ways in which we might give people increased opportunities to participate in the process. She also talks about this idea of taking their turn, right? Which I think gets at what you're talking about, Wynn, in terms of, hey, you know, we haven't had folks from a certain community be involved in decision-making or leadership in a while. How do we correct that, right? Do we create specific kinds of roles for people to play that give them political power in ways that may not happen if we were to sort of operate under the majority rule principle all the time?
All right, and it looks like we have, we'll just take these three more questions for you. First from Jim.
Hi, I think that would be me. You can guys hear me?
We
Yes.
can, yes.
Okay, my question has to do with the right-wing criticisms of CRT, or right-wing attacks on CRT. And one in particular really has always bothered me because I do not understand what the source of it is. It has something to do with this crazy notion that CRT teaches white kids to hate their race. Have you heard that one?
Yes, I have.
What does that mean, and where did that come from?
Well,
thank you very much, by the way, for being.
absolutely. I talked about what CRT is, right? This is legal theorizing and methodology in the law, and so it's about people illustrating how the law itself doesn't operate on behalf of racially minoritized communities. So it's not at all about how people interact necessarily, and especially kids in a classroom. But I do think that some folks, in their effort to try to help kids understand issues of race and racism, have tried to make it more personal for folks, and some people use that as a tool. And so I can imagine a scenario where a teacher may have tried to get kids to see how they are privileged by their race if they're white and so on, and it can lead to feelings of guilt. It can lead to feelings of emotional unrest or whatever. That's not CRT. That's a teacher, I think, making the mistake about how to work with kids who are probably too young to have the kind of conversation that maybe she or he wanted them to have. So there have been those things happening, but I can almost guarantee you that teacher was not well versed in CRT, and maybe was doing something that she or he thought was related to multicultural education. There is an area within multicultural education that focuses on prejudice reduction, and so it gets kids to identify what racism is and to think about it sort of with respect to their own personhood. But again, one has to be very careful about how they engage in those conversations with kids based on their age. There are certain things you should not do with young children that you could certainly do with high school kids, for example, right? So, and I think there have been some strategic errors in some folks, some well-meaning people who have been trying to advance this conversation. So people, Chris, Ruffo, and others have taken examples like that may be mostly real, or made up a little bit, but and use it as an example of how CRT is operating in the schools, and it's unfortunately a misnomer, and it's not true.
Thank you.
All right, and then Sudarshan.
Dr. Lynn, thank you for the framing. You started by saying that race is a social metaphor, and went down the path of who holds power, but didn't use the word power. There's privilege there, and there are systems in place to maintain that hierarchy. You also mentioned intersectionality with other identities. How would you suggest that we reconcile who holds power, for one, and then on the social dimension, how to question bias, whether it is explicit or implicit, to navigate through this path?
Yeah, I think, what I was advocating kind of on a smaller scale, through the prism of the party, was to be very forthright about recognizing, as you say, who holds power within the party, who has position, who doesn't, who speaks, who doesn't, right? Who engages, who doesn't, and to be intentional about trying to correct that to some extent, which means we have to be somewhat focused on race, right? And I think there's been a tendency among progressives to try to ignore or not deal with race because we don't want to offend anybody, or and I think there's this idea that if we just leave it alone and we don't talk about it, it'll go away. And unfortunately, it gets worse. I think we have to have sort of progressive, honest, and productive conversations about race that are really designed to be restorative, right? And to bring about greater inclusivity. And I think if we were more intentional about that within our organizations, within our schools, within various groups that we are in, that's the kind of thing that I would think would lead toward this broader social change. I think we could think about that with regard to Congress, right? There's a whole range of places and spaces I think we can have these kinds of conversations if we're thinking about sort of broad systemic shifts in the complexion of power and leadership in this country.
Thank you.
I think, and our final question, Rosa Colquitt.
Hello, everybody. Marv, I am so grateful to you for being in this space tonight and for your presentation. All of a sudden, I can't see you, but that's, oh, you're in the block further down on the screen. What I'd like to ask you about, we've talked a lot about what happens on the right and how those on the right are promoting CRT is something really negative for society. And you started to get into this conversation, this dialogue just a moment ago when you were speaking about progressives. So I want to ask you, for those who employ, and I've heard it a lot, not on the right, but on the left, who employ a colorblind ideology, the notion that I don't see race, I don't see color. Racism is kind of a negative discussion. And when we talk about critical race theory, I think it's so important that we help others to understand how that type of dialogue and that type of discourse can be very traumatizing for folks on the left, because we do get a little fixated with the right and the impact that it has, particularly on our children in terms of their education. I just wanted you to make a connection, if you can, or just perhaps answer my question on how we deal with this colorblind ideology with respect to critical race theory.
Yeah, I think that too is a key principle of CRT. There's a lot written about colorblindness and how dangerous that is. I once referred to it as a pathology because racism is here and it's among us all the time. And I think that you and I probably get accused a lot, Rosa, of being hyper focused on racism, right? And unfortunately, we don't have that choice because of the way we are treated in this society. I did an interview with a conservative British news station. If you go to my Twitter page, you see all these attacks on me and saying I'm delusional and all these other things, because what I said in the interview was, we Black folks would love to be able to forget about race every now and then, but we just keep getting reminded, right? So colorblindness, it's not possible because people are obsessed with race, whether they think they are or not. And sort of not talking about it doesn't make it go away. In fact, it makes it worse. So I think we have to be intentionally focused on race in productive ways in terms of how can we think about the impact that racism has had on our organizations, and how has it impacted the people who are racially marginalized, and how do we address those things, right? How do we restore maybe something that was never, have we really ever had full inclusion? I don't think we have. So how do we get to this place, I think, that Obama has helped me to think about in terms of a democratic society that is truly diverse and inclusive, and where these values around equity, diversity, and inclusion are all present, and we all feel like we can contribute equally. I think that's got to be the goal. But yes, in order to get there, we do have to talk about race. We have to be race conscious, and we have to be honest about racism and the impact on people of color in this country.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again. We really appreciate that presentation and you sticking around for a few questions. And we're really glad to have you as part of our community. So thank you again, and much appreciated.
Thank you.